Want to welcome everyone back, like I said, and today we're going to be talking about general hemp agronomic. Just want to welcome back our committee, our advisors that are joining us and helping out, answering questions. And also, we'll be providing webinars too. I see Scott Lewins from UVM is on, John Jemison from Maine, Caleb Gosen from Maine as well, Stephanie Smith from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Susan Brulette, who works with our team here at UVM, and Catherine as well, that's been setting up the online platform and coordinating this entire class. So we will get started. So I'm your presenter today, Heather Darby, UVM Extension. Righty, and I have been working on hemp here at UVM since I think 2015. I started working in 2014, just trying to get the proper permits to grow hemp, and it took me about 2 years to navigate the process before I was able to actually start conducting research at the university, and have been conducting research ever since and providing outreach just like we're doing now. So again, just gonna talk an overview of a little bit hemp botany and hemp agronomy. And as you can see, and I'm sure people have seen this before, hemp's been around for a while. I think we all know that. We decided not to talk too much about the history of hemp here. We felt like people probably have heard enough about that and could get that information pretty easily. So we won't focus too much on the long history that hemp has had, but certainly as a commercial crop being grown in the last 100 or so years, it just hasn't been. And, as a result of that, we don't have a ton of research on this crop, especially to be grown for grain and fiber, and now for flour production and essential oils. So the research itself is coming and starting, and people are working diligently to gain as much information as possible. But what we have is fairly limited. And really our goal here is to provide you with accurate information, research-based information. And that's what we're gonna draw from in this class, what's out there. So there are a lot of gaps, and we'll talk about those. So we are conducting research now in most every state across the country. That's 2018, but now in 2020, there are many states, the majority of the states, that have established research programs at their land-grant universities. And in fact, I'm a member of the S1084, which I mentioned last week, with Tyler Mark, and we have, I want to say there's about 75 different institutions that are involved in research that attend those meetings. So the body of knowledge is growing rapidly. And it is true, we do hear from people, not that often, but every once in a while, that say, you should just use the information from the marijuana industry. And it is true, there is some good information that's available through, that type of production, but it's not always applicable, and a lot of it is anecdotal as well. And so we are drawing from the fiber, grain, and now essential oil production literature. So I think everybody knows that hemp is in the cannabis family. And there are a few other crops, especially one that we grow here in the Northeast and throughout the United States that's related to hemp, and that's hops. And you may sort of see some similarities, but probably the biggest similarity that you might notice are these kind of yellow components, the resins that are in hops that are also in hemp. And if you smell hemp, you can pick up some of those same notes that we smell in hops, like the piney scents, the citrusy scents. We smell all of those in hemp and hops, and that's because they're in the same family. They produce many of the same terpenes, and we have had a few brewers here in Vermont and beyond that have started to play around using hemp flower to brew beer because of that. So again, some basics here, and I know for some of you this is really basic, but hemp is an annual. It is an herbaceous plant. It's tends to be bushy, but that really depends how it grows. It grows anywhere from about 2 feet tall, depending on the variety, up to 16 feet. I feel like I've seen hemp photos where hemp's even taller than that, but it is an annual herbaceous plant, so it is not a perennial. It is most commonly found, growing as a dioecious plant. So if you're unfamiliar with that term, it means that there are male and female plants, and you have to have both to basically produce seed. There are some monoecious varieties, and those tend to be grown for fiber. The other thing to note about this plant is that it is mostly photoperiod sensitive. So most varieties or lines that you grow are triggered to reproduce or to produce flowers or go into the reproductive phase when the day length starts to shorten. Now, there are auto flower varieties that have become available on the marketplace, and some of you may have seen those or grown those. Those are similar to many of the other crops that we grow, like corn, as an example, where there is a specific maturity. So some of the autoflower varieties are ready to harvest or are mature at 65 days after emergence, okay? So they are not impacted by day length. They flower after a certain number of days, and then they mature after a certain number of days. And these types of varieties are becoming a little more prevalent in the industry, especially in the resinous hemp production or for CBD or CBG production. We have started to see more of these varieties come on to the marketplace. Okie dokie. Okay, so female plants and male plants, like I said, here's a photo of a female plant. The flowers are in these auxiliary inflorescences. So we kind of call these the buds. And really those buds are composed of numerous flowers that are really congested and packed close together. And then when you're viewing those flowers, you often see the stigmas that are coming out of those flowers. And sometimes we wait to watch those kind of turn brown as an indicator for harvest timing. Flowering usually occurs, and again, this really depends on what type of production you're focused on, between July and September. And again, it depends on the variety and the end use. So many of our grain and fiber varieties are flowering in July. And some of our varieties that are being grown for CBD production really don't start initiating flowers sometimes until end of August, very early September. Male plants, here's a photo of a male plant. You can see it looks very different. They tend to be less leafy, really less robust, smaller stems. You can see the flowers here that are opening up and dispersing or shedding pollen. And that pollen is primarily wind dispersed. So I'm sure many of you have heard about some of the issues with cross-pollination. So if you're growing CBD hemp where you only want female flowers next to a farm that might be growing hemp for grain, there may be males in that field, and the potential for those males to spread pollen is there. Okay, so again, male plants are really, they should really mostly be common in grain and fiber production. Generally, if you're growing for essential oil production, CBD or CBG or flower buds, you're really only focused on the female plant, and you are getting rid of any male plants or male parts that you might find out in the field. Okay, so you really only want male plants if you're trying to produce seed. Otherwise, they're really not, you really don't want them, and I think probably everybody knows that. This is, you know, really what the bees visit. This is where they would get pollen and nectar to be able to bring back to their hives. All right, a few questions here. All right, I'm just going to move on here. All right, so I had already mentioned this, that flowering occurs usually from July to September, and ultimately depends on the variety itself and also what you're growing the crop for. And the plants grow vegetatively before that, and flowering is then triggered by a decreasing day length. So generally, as the day length gets towards, you know, 10 and 8 hours is when flowering starts to trigger. So one thing that I want to make clear, I'm not going to talk about planting date too much here today, but you do want to give your plant enough time to grow vegetatively. So the later that you plant and the closer you sort of get to that changing photo period, the shortening days, the less vegetative growth you'll have. And generally, in general, what we have observed is that planting really in, you know, kind of the third week of May into the very first weeks of June will provide you with the best yields and also quality, okay? Because you really want to have that time from flowering onwards to build up those terpenes and cannabinoids in your hemp plant, if that's what you're looking to harvest for, okay? So even though we can plant hemp in July, and many people have had to do this for various reasons, ideally you really want to plant that hemp in May and into very early June to give it the full season to be able to optimize yield and quality. Here's just a close-up again. So if you're growing to produce flower buds, flower, or, you know, with this goal of extracting out cannabinoids or terpenes, you're really focused on the female plant. You do not want any males, obviously, because you're not trying to produce seed. And once you really start producing seed, then those levels of terpenes and cannabinoids start to decline. So making sure that you have enough distance between your neighbors and that everybody around you is being very diligent about culling males will help you obtain a higher quality crop if you're growing for this purpose. All right, I was gonna check the chat box. Oh, I don't know what I'm doing here. Gary Fish was asking, you know, do bees visit female flowers and also pick up resins for making propolis? I'm sure they do. I'm sure many of you have seen bees out in the field. They're probably passing through. Sure, they're picking up material. I don't know, Scott, if you know more about that. I haven't necessarily looked for research on that, but I haven't seen any yet. Anything you want to add on that, Scott?
I haven't seen any bees foraging in hemp flowers, but I can't say for sure that they don't.
Yeah.
I'd agree, Steph. I'm Heather.
Oh, great. Thank you, John. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I hear people saying, oh, the bees love it. And I just, bees are in search of, nectar, pollen, protein, and sugar. Really, that's primarily what they're going for. So they would primarily be visiting the male plants. Okay, and then somebody was asking about the flower shape of a cannabis hemp bud. I think the term you're looking for is the cola. That's commonly what it's called. And then Jason is asking about how frost sensitive are seedlings and mature plants, and I'm going to get to that. So I'm going to keep going here. All right, so the hemp seed itself, here's a photo of the seed. So if you're growing for seed, whether you're going to use it to as a food source, to plant, or for some other reason, you can see what it looks like here. It's spherical. There we go. In shape, it's brown to sort of this like brownish black mottled color. I wish I had a better picture here, but you can kind of see it's not totally brown. You can see some streaks and little dots in it. It's not very heavy, right? So 1,000 kernel weight of hemp ranges from anywhere to 8 to 27 grams. And if you've grown hemp, you have probably seen this huge difference in the size of seeds and the weight of them. When you harvest hemp, much of the hemp seed, you can see this looks like green seed, but it's not. It's a calyx that's attached to the seed. It's green and it's really gummy. If the seed is ready to harvest, you'll still have some of that calyx attached to many of the seeds. And you can see that kind of green material makes it a little more difficult to harvest and clean. And we'll talk about that when we talk about grain. And again, this is an oil seed. 29 to 34% of the seed is oil. So a lot of people basically press and extrude oil from the seed, very similar to flax seed in its composition. Down. Oh. Okay, hemp stems. When you have uncrowded plants, hemp tends to produce lots of branches. So you can see here, this is one plant, not 5 plants. So the more space usually that you give hemp, many varieties produce lots of stems. And one of the, I guess, characteristics that some folks are really starting to select for in the resinous hemp field is for plants that are less branchy, have less branches. And if you've harvested hemp by hand, you know why. You want fewer branches with bigger flower buds. And so the more space you give it, generally the more stems, the more branches it'll produce. And the stem diameter, and many of you have seen this, like 2-3 inches, sometimes even bigger. They're like mini Christmas trees that need to be cut with chainsaws. So you give them the space and they'll, produce branches and a really big woody stem. When you start planting plants thicker and they become more crowded, they produce fewer branches. So here you can see some hemp being grown for fiber. They generally have far fewer leaves as well, and most of the leaves tend to be concentrated up near the top where the inflorescences are being produced as well. And the stem diameter tends to be much smaller when those plants are crowded together. So in 1/2 inch to 3/4 inches in diameter. And the stems tend to be woody, and they're usually hollow as well. And this actually contributes to the other characteristic that we know about hemp, that it's really good for producing bast fibers. It's a bast fiber plant. And here's that hollow stem that I'm talking about. Here's the green epidermis of the stem on the outside of the plant. And then right below that is what we call the bast fiber, that's made up of these cambium cells. And then just below the bast fiber is the hurd. So the bast fiber generally runs the whole length of the plant in one long string. They're very long fibers. Those are the transport vessels basically for the crop. And this is what's used to make that high quality fiber for linen and ropes. And then below that is shorter fibers, and that's called the hurd. And this is used to make things like hempcretes and bedding and plastics, okay? So this is what the stem looks like on a cross section. And the proportion of the bark on these hemp or the bast fibers and epidermis on hemp really ranges depending on the variety itself or the genotype. And obviously the height of the crop. So those longer, taller plants produce more epidermis and bast fiber and hurd. Okay, so you can see there's a pretty significant range depending on the genotype and the crop height. So let's talk about the roots of hemp plants. They are, let me rephrase, they can be amazing. That is one of the characteristics of hemp that people talk about a lot, is the fact that they have these enormous root systems, or can have an enormous root system. So they can have really long taproot that can has been measured to go down into the soil about 6 feet. Again, can be, right? This doesn't just happen. You have to have really nice quality friable soil to be able to get that deep taproot, but it is completely capable of producing a very deep taproot, as well as these lateral roots, which you can see here in the photograph. So it can have a really immense root system that helps to create really good soil health. So one of the characteristics that we see after growing some hemp is a more friable soil with better tilth that makes conditions really nice for the following crop. But again, you have to have the right conditions for these roots to really grow and explore the soil. So if you have really compacted soil, or maybe you have a really high water table, all those things can limit root production, as you already know, right? It already limits it in other crops, and it can limit hemp too. But given really good quality soil, hemp can have an immense root system. Okay. The leaves, I don't think anybody hasn't seen a hemp leaf somewhere on some kind of propaganda t-shirt, hat, just pretty characteristic leaf of cannabis is this palmately compound leaf that has anywhere from 5 to 12 leaflets. These are the little leaflets here that tend to be serrated. How serrated they are, how deeply they're lobed, you know, is really variable, even sometimes within a variety, but this is the characteristic leaf of a hemp plant. These leaflets, as you can see, vary in length and width. And again, some of that is dependent on where it's growing on the plant and also the variety itself. Okay, another part of the plant I thought I'd talk about quickly are the trichomes, and this is where the secondary chemicals are produced. So the terpenes and the cannabinoids and many other compounds as well, some that we know, some that we don't. They are actually produced and secreted into these trichomes. The trichomes have different classes, and if you've looked at hemp leaves or flower buds under the microscope, you've probably seen all of these. There's these bulbous trichomes. Those are the ones you normally are looking at when you're trying to figure out if the crop is ready to harvest. And then you have these sessile ones that look just like little kind of like rectangles. They just kind of poke up. And then there's the capitate ones that have kind of a flat cap on them. So there's lots of different types of trichomes on the plant. They're actually all over the plant. They're on the leaves and the stem, and they're concentrated in the flowers and the flower buds. So that's why that's our focus when we're harvesting for essential oils. So here you can see another close-up of the different types that are on the plant. And it's, you know, something you can buy a $20 little microscope to hook up to your iPhone or the computer, and you can see them pretty clearly. All right, so here's different chemicals that are found in cannabis. And again, some that we know something about, many that we don't. There are certainly a lot of claims made about what the cannabinoids do for you as humans, maybe your pets, but you know, some of those claims have certainly been substantiated and some of them have not. It's not something we're going to cover in this class. There's entire classes available to cover that topic. All right, so one of the characteristics of the hemp that we're talking about is that it has this very low THC level. And again, mostly those industrial hemp types are being grown for grain fiber and for production of phytocannabinoids like CBD and CBG. All right, so temperature, water, light. Just to summarize quickly, hemp is pretty widely adapted, which, you know, you should be able to see that because it's being grown, I think, in almost 50 states and all around the world. We have participants that have signed up for this class from everywhere, and that's great. That means that hemp can be grown in most places in the world. Now, of course, a little bit of a downside to that is that everybody can grow it. So it also means that anybody can really enter the market. And that kind of means, for us anyway, in a smaller place, specializing in our production will be really important. Hemp is fairly cold tolerant, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's also pretty tolerant to hot and arid conditions. And it doesn't really like waterlogged soils at all, and it loves full sun. So again, because it's so widely adaptable, it can kind of make its way in some places better than others. It does certainly prefer a temperate climate, but again, you know, if there's water, it can grow in the desert. And it can grow in Vermont, it can grow in Alaska, so it can also grow in very cold places as well. Okay, its preferred temperature range, so we talk about this for all crops, is between 60 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what it prefers. It can tolerate certainly colder temperatures, which many of you have seen, and it can also tolerate warmer temperatures. But what it prefers, right, this is the temperatures I prefer too, are 60 to 80, but certainly if it gets colder or hotter, we deal with it, and so doesn't hemp. It can withstand frost on seedlings, and I've had so many people say to me, oh, the hemp, like feral hemp or volunteer hemp germinated in my field in March and it's growing, or April and there's snow on it. So it is pretty frost tolerant as a seedling. And it's also fairly tolerant as an adult. And I'll show you some data in a minute. It takes about 2.5 months to produce a fiber crop. So really, it's a relatively, can be a relatively short crop, which is perfect for our region, right? You can grow a crop, a really good high biomass crop of fiber in just a few months. You know, if it's planted at the end of May, you should be ready to basically mow that crop down in early August. And for grain, it's about the same. You basically go from end of May, early June to Labor Day. Okay, this is a crop that's harvested for grain or fiber early summer, or I'm sorry, midsummer to end of summer, early fall. Now for flower production, the growing season tends to be much longer, especially for full season varieties. So we are planting roughly around the same time, and we're taking those varieties into really mid-September, end of October. Okay, so it is a crop that fits well here, but you can tell depending on the use how much time you need varies. Okay, so as far as temperature goes, we just harvested some hemp. When was that? So it snowed last Monday. Is that what we had, that snowstorm? Cold, 15 degrees on Saturday. I think Sunday was 20. We had a bunch of cold weather for sure. And then we had snow, and we went out and harvested some hemp on Wednesday or Thursday. And when I looked at the trichomes under the microscope, they were in perfect shape. What wasn't really in good shape were the leaves, right? So those leaves are fairly sensitive, that fine green material definitely does not like temperatures, sustained temperatures under 30 degrees. And even when we were getting that kind of 32-degree range, new leaves, and people probably saw this, new leaves kind of closer to the top of the plant where the flower buds were burned back. But overall, the flower bud itself was not really damaged by those kind of high 20, low 30 degree temperatures. But once we got below that, we definitely, and below 25, the plants definitely took a hit. They're woody stems, so that didn't really bother the stems. It was really the leaves. And then it sort of killed a lot of the green material on the plant. Now, again, the trichomes were fine, and it'll be interesting to see what the overall quality of those plants are. But hemp can withstand some pretty low temperatures in the fall. So here's a study that we did a few years ago, where we went out and put row cover over some of the hemp plants just to keep them warmer above freezing. And then we left some uncovered. And you can see there were several points in time, several days, where that hemp, or where the temperature dipped below 30 degrees, quite a few days. And that hemp actually ended up being fine. So you can see here, this is no row cover. You can see that there really was no difference in cannabinoids from no row cover, which meant it got really cold, to having row cover. All right, so dipping down into those temperatures below 30, at least for a short period of time, didn't have a huge impact, and this was on CBD. Now, I don't know how it impacted the terpenes, but I know this question has come up a lot. Of course, my agronomic advice is we need to be selecting for varieties that are ready to harvest before the end of October. I mean, we were harvesting into November this year. Ugh. Okay. Water requirements. Probably almost out of time. Nope, doing okay. Water requirements. Hemp requires a lot of water. I mean, to produce optimum hemp yields, you need 20 to 30 inches of, I say rainfall, but it can be any kind of water source during the growing period. Most of that water is needed in the first 6 to 8 weeks of the plant's life. So it needs about 10 to 14 inches just during that vegetative stage. That's when it's actually going to use the most water. So what is that? That's like 1.5 inches a week, basically, right? So this is going to be through the month of June into middle of July. Generally, you know, we get enough rainfall here to probably meet that need, but not always. So some people are using supplemental irrigation. Once flowering begins, the uptake of water decreases considerably, and then you get a slight increase of like the water need of the plant in late flowering, and if you're producing seed during seed formation. And I would say, you know, this really is the same water demand curve that most every plant, maybe except for watermelons, follows. You know, you have this strong need for water during the vegetative stage, right to about the reproductive stage, and then you get a slight uptick during seed production, and that is pretty common for a lot of crops. Now, of course, hemp can grow in the desert, but it still needs water to grow, right? So a lot of hemp that's grown in dry areas is definitely irrigated. Now, with a 6-foot taproot and a massive root system, you can clearly see how hemp can effectively, efficiently go after water, right, and nutrients in these very low depths. So it is very tolerant, or can be very tolerant to drought once it's fully established and it puts on a healthy root system. All right. I think I already talked about this. I think something that we've learned maybe the hard way before I read all the research is that hemp does not like waterlogged soils. It really does not like heavy, wet, clay, poor soil structure, poor drainage soils. And I've seen this in I've seen this in hemp being grown for CBD from transplants, and I've seen it in direct seeded hemp for CBD production and for grain and fiber production. Here's a picture that we took on one of the farmer's fields. I mean, this crop is just not going to amount to much. It becomes quickly stunted when there's too much water. We have irrigated hemp being grown for flour. And we've also just, let nature happen and, just whatever comes. And you can see that when we're growing hemp for flour production, for CBD as an example, we can optimize yields by irrigating over just rain-fed hemp. And we've done this for a few years. We grow quite a few of our trials without irrigation. And they tend to produce a bit less than the hemp that's irrigated. But again, irrigation costs money, and you have to have a good source of water. So soil limitations, what you're really looking for to grow hemp is well-drained loams, just like you want for every other crop that you might be trying to grow. But essentially, whatever's on your farm is what you have and you deal with it. And so, it's good soil physical properties and soil health that create good drainage and a good environment for roots to grow. And this is really what the key is when you're growing hemp. Okay, so if you don't have the most perfect, well-drained loams, you are looking for fields that have really good physical properties and soil health that are going to drain well and allow for that root system to really flourish. We've seen a lot of issues with hemp being grown on soils, clay soils that have 40% or more clay, but again, it is possible, but it takes some extra care. Adequate pH, really need a pH over 6. Hemp can grow in the 5.8 to mid-6 range, but with like most of our crops, we kind of want this slightly acidic soil. So we don't want anything really over 7, really something in the 6 range is good for hemp. And high organic matter soils, soils that are rich, deep, good soil health, that's where you're going to grow the best crops in general. Okay, hemp, like I said, very finicky when it's a baby. And this is hemp being grown for grain. And you can see the soil physical properties here are not good. You can see the crusting on top of the ground. And this hemp just can't come out of the ground. And we end up with really poor stands of hemp in fields that have poor physical properties, because the hemp as a baby, it's not strong. Once it gets to the ugly teenager stage, then there's no stopping it. So really, your goal as a consultant working with farmers is to help that farmer get a really good stand out of the ground so that you can have a high yielding crop that suppresses weeds and improves the overall tilth of the soil. But this kind of condition just leads to more weeds than hemp. Okay. And we've experienced this often. It is challenging to get really solid stands of hemp when they're planted from seed. And here's, some research from our trials where we only are getting 40% or 30% of the seed that we're putting in the ground. So you can see how this can impact plant yields and weed issues. Okay, so again, the seedling stage is very sensitive. And that's, you know, why a lot of people are transplanting, because you're able to have a little bit more of a controlled environment in a greenhouse, getting those babies off to a really good start, and then putting them in the ground and getting them growing from that point. So far, at least with flower hemp production, a lot of people are using transplants. Let's talk about soil fertility a bit. So get yourself a soil test. That's the extension specialist in me. So you can check the pH, you can check the overall nutrient levels in the soil. Hemp requires nutrients. And, you know, there's some older literature saying that, you know, hemp doesn't take much to grow. And, you know, it honestly doesn't take much to grow if you already have a really fertile soil. Okay, there are plenty of studies out there that do not show any response to hemp from adding nitrogen, and it's because of the background fertility in those soils. Those studies were conducted, a lot of them in the Midwest, on really fertile Midwestern prairie soils, and so there was no response at that time. You know, this is like 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but you know, those are for fertile soils. If you have a soil like this, you know, you're lacking phosphorus and potassium, and you need to add that to grow a good crop of hemp, as well as nitrogen and maybe some of the macro or micronutrients as well. So get a soil test. Fertility requirements. Now here's a pretty big gap in our knowledge. We do not have recommendations. We're working on those. There's a lot of work being done on this right now. That are specific for hemp. We're using other crops as indicators of what we should be fertilizing hemp for. What we do know, though, is that hemp utilizes very little phosphorus. It's critical, but it doesn't take up a lot of phosphorus. Only 0.5% of its biomass is phosphorus. And about 2 to 3% of its biomass is potassium. So it's a pretty heavy user of potassium, a lower user of phosphorus, and a very high user of nitrogen, okay? And what we've seen in the literature for fiber and grain, and now growing evidence in flower production as well, is that hemp in lower fertility soils will use anywhere from 100 to 200 pounds of actual N per acre to maximize productivity. So nitrogen tends to be the limiting nutrient for many people, okay? And it's just like most other crops, nitrogen tends to be the limiting factor. So we've done some studies, and we continue to do those. And you can see here, when we add 125 pounds of nitrogen up to 150, it's at 125 that we maximize the amount of nitrogen in the hemp plant. Okay, so you can see here's that 3% level. So adding more than 125 pounds did not give us more nitrogen into the plant, meaning that the plant probably didn't need any more, okay? And so right now for us in Vermont, we're thinking mostly the recommendation is going to range again between this 100 and 150 pounds, depending on the background fertility. All right. There's a lot of disagreement in the literature and in, I don't know if I call this gray literature, but stuff you read on the internet that you do not know where it came from. But we have seen that high nitrogen, or I have read in papers that high nitrogen rates can stimulate the formation of male flowers. I feel like I've seen this in our grain hemp. We have not seen this in our flower hemp. So this year we used the variety Lifter. Last year it was a variety Box. And we have not seen any increase in male flowers as a result of increasing the amount of nitrogen. So I think this, verdict is probably still out. Now, we also apply nitrogen in split applications. And I think that obviously would help any negative impacts that you might see by just adding a huge slug of nitrogen at one time. So we provide the plant split applications from the time of transplant, weekly applications up to the point at which the plant starts to flower, and then we stop applying nitrogen. I have seen lots of plants that are nitrogen deficient. They turn a beautiful bright yellow color. And once they are nitrogen deficient, I have found hemp very difficult to turn around and recover from that. So, your best bet, of course, is to make sure that you have the fertility that you need when the plant is growing, so that you don't get to a point where the plant is very stressed out. Phosphorus. So, in the New England, the Northeast, we have varying soil conditions here. Some soils have plenty of phosphorus, way more than you'll ever need in a lifetime of farming. And then some fields are very low in phosphorus. So you may need to add phosphorus. But again, you got to look at a soil test. If the soil test is low or medium in phosphorus, you'll probably see a benefit to adding a small amount to the soil. Hemp does use most of its phosphorus during flowering, and not as much during the vegetative phase. So again, just make sure that you have that phosphorus available to the plant, especially at flowering time. Potassium fertility. The plant does take up a good amount of potassium, and potassium is a nutrient that you're going to want to make sure you primarily apply, especially if you need a lot of it at the beginning of the growing season. You don't want to be applying a lot of potassium or a slug of potassium right around the flowering time, because it can delay maturity and may inhibit essential oil production. There was one paper, I think, that showed that. So again, this is, we just don't have a lot of information on managing fertility at this point. Okay, micronutrients. Definitely hear a lot about adding micronutrients to hemp, especially being grown for cannabinoid production. I will say with some confidence that hemp requires an extraordinary amount of magnesium, and it also requires a good amount of boron. Now, boron tends to be deficient in soils in New England, so that may be a nutrient that you want to pay attention to, especially if you are on very light textured soils. And if you're taking a soil test, you will get a value for magnesium, and a soil test should also tell you if you're deficient in magnesium. So you will know if you need to add it. So I'm getting short on time, and the most important thing I wanted to talk about today is crop rotation, because you're all consultants, or most of you, some of you might be farmers too, and you're working with farmers. And I think one of the basic principles of good crop production is crop rotation, and hemp needs to be rotated. Okay, there should be no such thing as the hemp field. This is my hemp field. This is where I grow hemp. This is where I grew hemp last year, and the year after, and the year after that. We are just in the beginning of growing hemp. So people probably have gotten away right now with growing hemp for a couple of years, maybe 3. But at least in Vermont, what we're seeing on fields that are moving into their 2nd and 3rd years of production, they are seeing a lot of disease issues, okay? One of them being this septoria leaf spot, which was running rampant in some of our fields in Vermont. And septoria leaf spot overwinters on crop residue, okay? So hemp is susceptible to a lot of diseases that can build up in the soil over time. So as you start to see more hemp being produced, this is going to become an increasing issue. White mold impacts hemp. So if you're growing soybeans that have white mold issues, or snap beans, or any number of other crops, sunflowers, and then you put hemp in that field, that hemp is susceptible to white mold too, okay? So people keep asking me, well, what's the best rotation with hemp? Use the knowledge that you already have about growing crops and mixing up broadleafs and grasses. And we do know the diseases that impact hemp, which makes it a little bit more like easier to develop a rotation. Now, there's hardly any literature out there on crop rotation in hemp, but the few articles I could find said that hemp really should not be grown more than 2 years before you start to see yield decline. So basically 2 years, and then you need to rotate. And again, you have to watch for diseases. You know, like every crop, you should have a really solid 4 to 6 year rotation. But you know, in the minimum, no more than 2 years in hemp, and then you got to get out of hemp for at least a couple of years. But again, the knowledge we have is pretty limited on this, but I don't, you know, we could use more research for sure, but it doesn't really take research to know how to build a pretty decent crop rotation. So really, I think what I've been thinking a lot about is, so what is the benefit of having hemp in a rotation, okay? And we talked about this last week in the presentation, that hemp is likely going to become a part of people's operation. You know, there may also be people that just grow hemp, but it'll be a part of our diverse operations that we have in New England. Now, hemp, there was one research project that showed that hemp suppressed Verticillium dahlia, which I'm sure is familiar to many crop consultants, a nasty disease, Verticillium wilt. And it also helped to control 2 root knot nematodes, which are also very devastating. Now, this is one paper that showed this, that the subsequent crop did not have hardly any issues with these 3 soil pathogens, and that the hemp suppressed them. Okay, one paper. Now, we also know that hemp can effectively suppress weeds and can require no herbicide. Now, most people you talk to say, the weeds were ridiculous, whether they were growing for flour, fiber, or grain. Now, for fiber and grain, if you get a solid stand of hemp, like I was talking about, right? You have good soil conditions, get it planted on time, boom, the hemp comes out of the ground, you get a really great solid stand of hemp. Once it gets to, like I said, that ugly teenager stage, about knee high, weeds will not be an issue, okay? Unless you have something just so horrendous, you shouldn't be growing anything there anyway. And it is true, you know, you won't need to use herbicides. But right now, this is not the norm. People are not getting those thick stands of fiber and grain, because we need to learn how to grow this crop and get good stands. But it is true that you can grow them without herbicide, and we have, I mean, and have had great stands. This is the ugly teenager stage I'm talking about. They're just kind of spindly and wobbly, but then, man, they take off with that heat and moisture, and watch out. Just quickly, because we are at time and I'm still blabbing away, we are doing more work on cover crops and hemp, and hopefully we'll talk about that more with CBD production. And hemp as a rotation crop, I think there's huge benefits here because of that root system and the weed suppressive capabilities and the amount of organic matter that is gonna or can go back into the soil, especially when you're growing for fiber and grain. And just, you know, the ability for this plant to produce a lot of biomass has shown that subsequent crops, and again, there's very little research on this, wheat and soybeans in particular, had yield boost. So I think I'm gonna end on that. And so one question is, auto flowers are not sensitive to day length. Correct. So autoflowers will flower at a certain date and then mature and be ready. At least the ones I've worked with have been 68 days to maturity or to harvest. And there's one from Oregon CBD that is 95 days. Okay, where should I look for volunteering to do some cooperative research programs? I wish you would have contacted us a month ago. We could have used your help harvesting. I think reach out to us. We're definitely always looking for an extra hand, especially during harvest. Mary is asking, what size, how old seedlings clones should be planted late May, early June? I'm thinking this will be talked about in the resinous oil talk, but usually we grow our starts for about 20 days and then they're ready to put in the ground. And I think that's where a lot of people have gotten into some trouble, where they start their plants from seed too early. And just know that they will pop up and grow very quickly. So it's basically about 20 days from the time the seedling emerges. They will get leggy very fast. On the irrigation graph, what are the units? Yes, that's pounds per plant. Sorry about that. Somebody else asked that. That is pounds per plant. Let's see here. Does research on the 125-pound correlate with optimum yields of flowers and components and economic return? So, yields, we did not see any suppression or increase, Willie, to cannabinoids, and no consistent trends with terpenes at 125 pounds. So we didn't see inflated THC, and we didn't see depressed CBD either. So it seemed like we have not calculated if that's the best economic return yet, but based on that, it very, very well might be. How did you apply the split applications? We applied ours through irrigation. So we had drip irrigation and we applied the application that way. And certainly you could do it broadcast as well. It really just depends how you're set up. If you have plastic, obviously, it's harder to broadcast fertilizer. So irrigation would be the best way. Have we seen phosphorus deficiency due to cold soils? So, you know, it's interesting, Cheryl. I have not really seen much of it. Maybe because we're planting generally in June, the soil's fairly warm at that point. And most of what we're putting into the ground are transplants, but I haven't seen huge issues. But I haven't looked that closely either. But I'm sure, and I have seen that in the literature, that certainly can be a problem. And you see the same purpling is what has been noticed. Willie is concurring that he has seen magnesium and boron deficiency in Vermont hemp. And it makes sense. Boron is commonly deficient in Vermont soils. And so we definitely should be adding small amounts of boron. And usually, you know, we're talking about a pound per acre. If you rotate, can you use the field for other plants, or do you have to wait? No, absolutely use it for other plants. And other plants, again, may benefit from hemp in the rotation. You know, again, because of that root system, they may break pest cycles. But again, you have to be a little bit, you know, thoughtful about what you follow hemp with. So if you're experiencing a lot of a certain disease, and you know that hemp gets that disease and so doesn't soybeans or snap beans, as an example, you wouldn't want to rotate into that. Somebody is asking me if I experience a crop that tests hot around 0.4 on the first test, do you think there's any chance it will pass subsequent tests, or should we just destroy it and move on? Anybody want to chime in on that? Anybody? Gary, in your experience, I guess. Oh, you can't talk, sorry. That's not funny. But we haven't tested twice. I'm not seeing the chat, so I don't know if anybody.
Hey, Heather, it's Stephanie.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you, Stephanie. I forgot. Yes, yeah. Awesome.
So I'm not going to be able to actually answer the question. I don't have any evidence. We've not done any research regarding like a first test and a second test, but from the regulatory perspective, we require a compliance test in the state of Vermont that shows, so you have to do a pre-harvest sample no greater than 28 days before you harvest. You take the sample, you have to have a test result. That test result has to be compliant. So it's a timing thing in Vermont, but specifically to the question, I do not know. So I just wanted to share that information, but I understand that it's not actually answering the question. But if you do have a lot that exceeds the THC requirements in the state of Vermont, and you don't have a compliant test in the future, as suggested by the question, then destruction would be what would be required. So it's just, I guess, a matter of whether or not you want to try to retest.
Yeah, and I think Gary said it's going to go up, likely. Everybody is saying that. Okay. Sorry, that's not probably what people want to hear. All right. Can you use the same plant for seed harvest and fiber harvest? And yes, the short answer is yes, you can. And a lot of people are harvesting dual purpose crops where they are basically going in and harvesting grain, and then they go back in and they'll mow down the fiber and then bale that up. And again, it's not high quality. It wouldn't go for rope or clothing, but it can go into a different chain, such as, you know, for hempcrete or bedding. All right. Any insects or mites that attack hemp? We're gonna worry about those. We'll worry about that next week, right, Scott? Scott will be covering all things pests next week. Have I seen male flower production from nitrogen in feminized seed plants? So I have not seen any consistent trends. And that's one of the things that we look for in our study, are male flowers, to see if nitrogen rate is increasing male flowers in our feminized seed plants. And do I recommend adding fertilizer foliarly? I generally don't, unless there is a deficiency that is very visible to try to save the plant. But again, that's just me. I've never been really big on foliar fertilizers, but some of the crop consultants on here might type in what they've recommended to folks. I know Willie's on here. He's working with a number of hemp growers, and I think Abba, you were on here too. Both may be recommending foliar fertilizers. All right. I think I answered all the questions. I hope everybody learned a lot. There's a lot to cover here, as you can tell, and that was just the basic agronomy. I never even got to, I'm trying to take a picture of the CCA credit thing, so I get credits for my own presentation. There's a lot to cover, and I really didn't get to talk much about phytoremediation or some of the environmental benefits, but I will definitely cover those later on.